Hi, I'm Femi OK and you're in the stream. Today, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani made a lot of promises during his election campaign. 1 year later, we ask Iranians, how is he doing? So there are always challenges with our audience in Iran actually being able to get online to watch this program, to join in the show. So Malika Bilal, digital producer of the stream, how are they doing with that challenge?
Well, on the one hand, we are hearing from Iranians inside Iran. On the other hand, it is difficult. So Kareem actually tweets us from Iran, and he describes what the biggest issues for him in Iran 1 year after Rouhani's presidency election. He says restricted access to the internet was one of them, and he went on to tell the stream how difficult it is for him to participate in this conversation, and we appreciate it. So for those of you at home, we want your participation as well. You can tweet us your questions and comments with hashtag AJStream.
So joining our conversation here in the studio, we have Reza Marashi, and Reza is the research director at the National Iranian American Council. Reza, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And we will hear so much more from you in just a moment.
Hi, my name is Shehla. I am an activist and I'm in the street.
So more than 18 million Iranians chose Hassan Rouhani to be their president in Iran's 2013 elections. As the only moderate in the final list of mostly conservative presidential hopefuls, Rouhani described his win, I'm going to quote him here, as a victory of moderation and a commitment over extremism and ill temper. End of quote. His election campaign focused on the promise of change. He pledged better and more constructive engagement with the West, improving the economy, easing international sanctions. He also promised Iranians greater personal freedoms as well. So, more than a year later, how has President Rouhani done? So to help us talk about this, we're also joined by Mohammed Marandi. He's an associate professor of North American Studies at the University of Tehran. Gisou Nia is a human rights lawyer and soon to be deputy director at the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran. And Sharmeen Nawani is a commentator and analyst covering the Middle East. So guests, welcome. Great to have you all here on board. I'm just going to ask you this, just a pop quiz to go around all of you. If you had to give President Rouhani a grade for the past year, what would that grade be, Reza?
I think I'd give him a B, but I say that not because I think he's doing an outstanding job, but I think that he faces probably the more obstacles than any other Iranian president that's come before him.
Right.
And understanding that, given what he's been willing to say at the podium and what he's been willing to do tangibly, because he has had some successes, I think, and compared to his predecessor, frankly, I think I'd give him a reasonably good grade, but it's hard to judge a president 1 year into his presidency.
Right, but B's not bad for a start. Okay, so Mohammed, sitting there in Tehran, in Iran, what would be your grade for your president?
I would give him a high grade. I can't say A or B. It would be somewhere in between, but I think he's done quite well for the first year.
Sharmeen?
I concur with both the speakers. I think with what he has on his plate, he's done a pretty good job and shown a lot of initiative, and I think that counts a lot.
Bold enough to grade him?
Yeah, same, you know, a high B.
Ooh. Gisou, are you going to keep the average up, the grade average up, or not?
I don't think so. On a scale of 1 to 10, when it comes to foreign policy, I'd give him a 7. When it comes to the economy, I'd give him a 5. And when it comes to human rights and civil liberties, I'd give him a 3.
Let's just check in with what the community is saying.
Well, they're also giving their own grades. Iran LGBT says, compared to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's 8 years, the previous president, I give Rouhani 20 out of 20. Compared to Rouhani's campaign promises, though, 9 out of 20. And Reza Kareem, tweeting us from Iran, I read his tweet at the very beginning of the show. He also answers this question. He says 60 out of 100 because of reforming college, improving the economy, progress in nuclear talks, opposing forced hijab, defending minorities' rights, lots of positives there. So what are the positives for you?
Well, I think there are a couple. 3 stand out to me. 1, he's made improvements on the economy. to the extent that inflation is down. He's providing a greater level of hope, because there is a certain aspect of hope that requires economic stability.
So Reza, how did he do that? What were his policies that actually did that?
Well, I think putting competent managers in place and putting people in place who have a long-standing track record of managing the economy in a more effective way during the 1990s and early 2000s.
Did he have to fire a load of people?
No, I think, you know, people come in and out as presidents cycle in and out of office. And, you know, Ahmadinejad and his closest advisors were, to put it diplomatically, not very popular across the board, both politically and in society. So it provided an opening to bring people in who have a demonstrated track record of being more competent managers.
Right, okay. So Mohammed, if you were talking about what your president's done that you are most impressed by in the short span of 1 year, what would you point to?
The main challenge that Iran faces is obviously the United States, and the United States tried to, for years, depict that Iran as the problem, whereas from the Iranian perspective, the ball has always been in the American court. So in the past few years, the United States, whenever it wanted to continue with more sanctions against ordinary Iranians, they would say Iran is a threat. And whenever they didn't want to negotiate, they would say President Ahmadinejad has no authority. It's sort of paradoxical, because they'd say he's a threat to the world, but elsewhere they'd say he had no authority. President Rouhani, by changing the narrative, by changing the discourse in foreign policy, I think he put the Americans in a very difficult situation, and the consensus that the Americans were trying to build against Iran has been falling apart. Of course, this also coincides with the rise of ISIL, which is also very much
so Mohammed, let me just ask you, because I just asked you something,
but in any case, I think he's done well.
I asked you something very, very specific, because I said, so what are you most impressed by? And then you went back to Ahmadinejad and also talked about America's relationship with Iran. But what are you impressed by what your president has done? The focus here has got to be on Iran right now.
Well, I think that's very important. He has had a very effective. He's represented Iran very effectively in the United Nations in his interviews, and his foreign minister has also done a very impressive job. And I think that's put the Americans in a very difficult situation. Countries no longer are very interested in the American narrative on Iran, and the sanctions regime and the attempt to build a consensus against Iran has impacted the economy, and it has impacted on has an impact on Iranians at all levels. So I think that's extraordinarily important what he's done, and I think that's a major achievement.
Malika.
You know, Femi, Professor Mohammed said he represented Iran to the international community online. We're also hearing that same thing. Al-Borz on Twitter says more Western delegations have visited Iran in the past 1 year under Rouhani than all previous years. So Gisu, in terms of international foreign policy, have you been impressed?
I think, you know, one thing that's coming out in these comments from both the online community and the people on the panel is comparing Rouhani to what came before. There's no question that they've increased the level of diplomacy. I mean, Ahmadinejad is really not a standard to compare Iran's president to. So, you know, in terms of certainly at the UN, when I was there last year at the UN General Assembly about a year ago, you could see that countries in attendance were very impressed with the change in the Iranian delegation, the fact that they felt like they now have a real diplomatic partner to engage with. And that was something that was simply missing in the 8 years before. However, there are certain things that Rouhani promised on the campaign trail that go beyond simply resolving the nuclear issue and resolving the economic situation at home. And those include increasing personal liberties and freedoms. And I'm afraid that we haven't seen much advancement on that point, but the blame cannot be placed on Rouhani. It can be placed on the judiciary and other power brokers in the governmental structure in Iran that I think are really preventing those advancements.
Let me just remind you, there's a little clip here from the organization that you're just about to join, Gisu, which reminds us about some of the things that President Rouhani said during his election campaign. This one in particular about personal freedom. So have a listen to this.
National strength is realized when we provide freedoms to all of our people. Let us not interfere in people's private lives every day. If we want to uproot corruption in society, we must give freedom to the press and media. Viewing the arts as a security concern is the biggest mistake. Let us not allow people who have no relevant expertise to control books, films, and other cultural products. Many writers have been banned from writing. Proponents and opponents of government are both respected and dear to us. They have equal rights. We must tolerate diverse views.
So this was part of a campaign by the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran, Sharmeen, and it actually, you'll see what the president is saying and then what actually happens. There's a little disconnect between those two things. So if we're looking at this first year, these amazing election campaign promises, and then what's been delivered as far as personal freedoms are concerned, does that give you any area where you're thinking, well, he did let Iranians down. He promised a lot, he delivered very little?
Well, you know, first years are always hard. Expectations are high, and it's very hard to sift through political waters in countries where the political process is quite contentious. I mean, look at U.S. President Obama. He promised us to shut down Guantanamo Bay in year one, and 6 years on, that hasn't happened. So there are many things that inhibit these kinds of things from moving forward. You know, but the question was, what is it I appreciate about what he's done the first year? And you know, this is a man who pledged to lower regional conflict and be a peace broker. And I think it's not what we expected from Iran. Those of us who know Iran better, maybe so, but certainly not the international community. And in year one, he's brought Iran in from the cold. And I think that's a significant achievement.
Reza.
I think both of these ladies are 100% right, and I think that speaks to a larger issue here, which is, one, you can't expect a president to achieve all he hopes to achieve within one calendar year. No president in any country can realistically do that. But also, it speaks to the fact that President Rouhani, long before he was ever president, was an inside baseball, behind-the-scenes political operator that prefers to get things done not at the podium, but behind closed doors, trying to create consensus within the Iranian system, whether you love it or you hate it. That's who he is. He's not like the former reformist president, Mohammad Khatami, who's going to give a very poetic speech at the podium, but perhaps not have the same political chops behind the scenes trying to get stuff done. What are you hearing that he's doing behind the scenes? Let me just before you answer that, let me just show our audience something back here. This is known as the Rouhani meter. It was actually put together by a university in Toronto, the Monk School for Global Affairs, and they kept track of 73 reported promises that were made during the election, during campaign time, and they're just keeping track. It's only been just over a year. So far, 7 achieved, 26 in progress, 4 not achieved, and 36 nothing is happening out there. What do you think's happening behind the scenes? That's a great meter. I hope they have a Harper meter in Canada, because they need one, Lord knows. I would say at the end of the day, what's going on behind the scenes is an effort, A, to try to get Mousavi and Karoubi, the 2009 presidential election candidates, out. That's not something that can be done at the podium. So right now, just to remind people, they are under house arrest, and they have been for far too long, and in my view, they never should have been under house arrest in the first place. I think this is something that Rouhani spoke about during his campaign. It's something he's been trying to achieve, but it's not something that's going to happen out in public. It's something that's going to happen behind the scenes. There's a lot of political horse trading going on, and should we be upset that it hasn't happened so far? Absolutely. Is he trying? In my mind, no question. Sure.
Well, on things that people aren't that happy about, Gisu, we have this tweet from iRevolt. He says, since Mr. Rouhani took office, his regime, this person says, is hanging an average of 3 prisoners a day, the vast majority after unfair trials. And that's what this person tweeted us. But Gisu, we also have a video comment from someone named Maryam Malikpour, and her brother has been detained in Iran. She talks about personal freedoms and what she hopes for the future. Have a listen to this.
This October 4th will mark the 6 years Saeed has been locked up in Evin prison. I'm hoping and praying Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, hears me and do the right thing by releasing him from prison and conducting an investigation into his case. I hope Dr. Rouhani follows up my brother's case and doesn't leave him alone. every day I pray for this nightmare to end.
So Gisu, she says every day she prays for this nightmare to end. When you hear stories like that, and you hear stories about human rights abuses, people say, what do you think?
Well, you know, Rouhani last year around this time was talking about a citizens' rights charter that his government was going to draft, and that this would secure minority rights, and that this would ensure that personal freedoms were respected in Iran. And what happened was that a draft document was released which largely reinforced existing discriminatory laws and wasn't really anything new. Since then, the final document hasn't come out. But the reason that people like Maryam Malekpour and the families of people like Omid Kokabi, an Iranian scientist who has been jailed for several years now on unclear charges, the families of people like human rights lawyer Abdul Fattah Soltani and Mohammad Saifzadeh, these agents of change who are locked up on for unclear reasons. It's usually described as national security endangerment or propaganda against the regime. Right. They're looking for answers. And I should say that in respect to Rouhani, you know, since we're talking about what we want to see him do, he said last week when he was in New York in his interviews with Christiane Amanpour and with Fareed Zakaria, he said that all these cases are with the judiciary and that the judiciary is independent. Well, 2 points on that. First of all, the judiciary is not independent in the sense that the Ministry of Intelligence bears a great weight on judges and influences their decisions. Secondly, there is a lot, you know, the Iranian presidency is never an enviable position. The president comes in, there's a honeymoon period with the supreme leader who ultimately controls everything in the country. And then we see that towards the end of the president's tenure, there's really a souring of that relationship. Ahmadinejad fell out with the supreme leader. Khatami fell out with,
Gisu, you're debating with another interview that was on another TV show, but I want you to actually focus back here with us. I'm looking at President Rouhani's Twitter thread here. He also tweets in English, and back here he says, regarding human rights, believe country's atmosphere has actually improved since elections last year. And he says, I encourage a visit to our university campuses. So Gizu, while you were speaking, Mohammed was actually smiling. Mohammed, what do you know that we don't know? You're sitting there in Iran. What do you know about this human rights issue that maybe we're not getting from outside?
Well, I think that a lot of the comments that are being presented here are not really all that reflective of reality. Iran is not a dark and desperate place. There are many checks and balances in the system. The very fact that President Rouhani won an election with 50% of the vote and a turnout of over 70% shows how dynamic the system is and how popular the campaigns were and how people were involved in the campaign. 4 years ago, Mr. Ahmadinejad also won in a contest with a very high turnout.
So Mohammed, nobody is questioning the popularity and how successful your president was during the elections. Nobody is questioning that. But the question of people being in prison, people not having a trial, human rights issues that Gisu just talked about right there, could you address those?
Well, no, because you're giving a specific example which I have not studied. I can tell you about an Iranian in the United States who was held in solitary confinement, Mr. Sayed Mahmoud Mousavi, held in prison for 3.5 years under trumped up charges, and he just died last week, and I went to his funeral. He died of cancer that he got in solitary confinement in the United States, and I'm not quite sure how many of these human rights organizations have said anything about him.
I'm sorry, if I may.
Go ahead.
Well, the thing is, you're asking me a question about a particular case that I'm not involved in.
I don't have to ask the particular cases, but just this idea here, and this is your own president saying, I believe the atmosphere has actually improved since elections last year. What is he talking about? What is the improvement? I'm not talking about a specific case.
Well,
just a general
in general,
feeling that
I think that what has changed is that Well, I think that in general, the feeling is that we have, since 5 years ago, the presidential election was contested. And after the elections, there were riots and there were protests by those who felt that there was fraud. By the way, President Rouhani has said repeatedly that there was no fraud in the previous election. And so have the leaders of the Mousavi campaign, who some of them are in the cabinet. But I think after this recent election, just one point, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
After this election, I think what happened that has changed the mood is that President Rouhani won the election with a roughly 50% of the vote. No one challenged him. No one said there was fraud. All the other candidates accepted the results. And the debates were heated but very civil, contrary to 5 years ago. And I think that has matured. That shows that both the candidates as well as their supporters have behaved much more maturely.
All right, Mohammed, I'm going to squeeze some more of our community in because I don't want to get stuck on this election. I'm actually talking about the last year. Appreciate your thoughts, your take there. Let me just share the conversation just a little bit.
Right.
Malika.
Well, really picking up on what Professor Mohammed was saying, online people are saying actually it doesn't really matter because, Irfan tweets, Rouhani's a charming president, but we all know who's actually running Iran. That's Khamenei, that's the supreme leader, Ayatollah, and the Revolutionary Guard. Sharmeen, another person says, doesn't matter. He serves at the whim of the supreme leader. He's just another worthless puppet head. Does it matter, Sharmeen?
Yeah, you know, we're kind of going into the realm of canned narratives here. I mean, Khamenei is very powerful, but Iran is probably has the most dynamic political system in the entire region, bar Turkey. Certainly much more than many of its neighbors. You know, they have diverse media and politicians who yell at each other in parliament and voice their dissent. You know, it's unfair to say that. And you know, there's a disproportionate amount of energy spent on Iran's human rights situation when this is a country that has been under the most severe prohibitive sanctions regime of all time and is under siege on its various borders, you know, from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from GCC countries that have Patriot missiles, you know, given by the United States, aimed at Iran. Exactly why are we focusing on the human rights issues ad nauseum? There's more to what Rouhani has to deal with, and they're far more pressing at a time when states, the territorial integrity of states around Iran are fracturing and states are fragmenting and disappearing from the map, you know? So I, for one, would like to move on.
Sure. It's interesting because we did a tally of the president's tweets since his inauguration, the ones he's been tweeting in English. And if you have a look here, you'll see perhaps where his focus lies. So about 16% of those tweets have been nuclear energy and relations with the West, 4% on the economy, and 5% on human rights, personal freedom, and government transparency. So that kind of backs up exactly what you were saying, Sharmeen. Reza, where do you want to leave us before we wrap up this part of the show?
I don't ever think you can talk too much about human rights. I'd like to think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Yes, Iran being under siege from sanctions and other forms of pressure is absolutely important and it needs to be addressed. But, you know, international community more broadly and political leaders more specifically, it's their job to walk and chew gum at the same time. It's their job to balance these issues. So Rouhani is no exception to that rule, and other Iranian officials are no exception to that rule. Iran's human rights record is not good. They should be criticized for it. Rouhani has made improvements on Iran's foreign relations and in the nuclear negotiations. He should get credit for it.
Right.
Apples and oranges.
All right, that's Reza Marashi. He is the research director at the National Iranian American Council. We also have Gisru Niaz. She's the incoming director at the Iranian International Campaign, Sharmeen Nawani, and also Mohammed Marashi. They're all coming with us to the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. So on Monday, I am going to be on the other side of the Atlantic. So what's going to be happening on the Monday show?
You will be watching Monday show.
I'm always watching.
It will be interesting. We're tackling a very interesting topic, asking, is sexism in medicine killing women? Some say there's a gender bias in the way female patients are diagnosed and treated, and we'll discuss why on Monday. Until then, we'll see you online.
Hello, this is the Stream's online post show. We've been talking about the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani's first year in office. Shamin, you brought up a really good point here. I made a little note here. What are we missing? When we're looking at this first year, what are we missing? There's certain things that do jump out, that international media jump on because they understand and it resonates with them for stories that come out of Iran. But what are we not seeing?
For me, the area I think that the international media misses is of course this focus, hyper focus on things that are of interest to an American government audience, perhaps. But Iran,
we have an international audience, Shamin. So don't play to that audience. We have an international audience. I really care about what is happening in Iran that we're not hearing about. That's been driven by President Rouhani.
I think one of the things that is kind of outstanding about this administration is that it's doing what we'd like to see politicians do more. International relations is important. It produces economy, for instance. It produces jobs. It protects your national security. And this team has done a stellar job in trying to forge relations across borders where there were tensions under perhaps the previous administration, and try to peacemake and diffuse conflict in areas around it. And I think that's really important because the world is really transforming now, and you have new blocs and new alliances coming together that are going to be part and parcel of what's coming in this new world order, a multilateral world. And Iran is going to play a big role in that because it is, in a sense, one of very few regional hegemons. And I think that's something I'd like to see more about in the global media.
Shamin, you know what I notice is that before Iran would be left out of, I don't know, conferences and deals and agreements, but now people are saying, well, actually, where is Iran in this? Is Iran going to come to the table with this? And now people are concerned that Iran should be in the mix. That is a distinct difference in about the last, I don't know, year, 18 months. Am I imagining that, or are you feeling that too?
No.
Yeah.
No, you hit the nail on the head.
It's like if they're not there, we're asking why they're not. Yes.
Yes. And Iran has always been an important player in this region, and we've kind of just ignored this in general. But I think there are very few deals and changes that can take place in the region today without Iran's participation. Sure. And still, we're not seeing calls for that as much as we should.
Reza.
Yeah, look, any kind of durable political solution or political agreement that countries agree to, it's only durable if countries that have the capacity to wreck the agreement are at the table. That was true under Rouhani, that was true under Ahmadinejad, and that was true under Khatami, Rafsanjani, all the Iranian presidents, right? So we know that. And now we have people that the West has very openly said we can do business with in the Iranian presidency when it comes to these types of negotiations. I would like to think that because Iran has what I like to call regional realists at the helm of foreign policy now, there will be a matching of efforts in countries like Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. I think there's reason for hope. The Iranian foreign minister met the Saudi foreign minister at the UN General Assembly, and they hailed a new chapter in bilateral relations. This is very important, and let me tell you why, because I don't want to ramble here, but there's an important point to be made here.
I like the answer. I like the way you're posing your own question and then answering it.
Let me pose the question and answer, please. At the end of the day, all of the countries in the Middle East over the past 8 years have been viewing security through a zero-sum lens, meaning if I'm winning, you must be losing, and vice versa. That doesn't work. They need collective security. They need to work together to promote security. If somebody's security comes at the expense of somebody else, that other person is going to continue to try to wreck the solution. It's not rocket science.
Is this down to one person? Is this down to a president? Can a president create that mindset change?
I don't know if a president can create the mindset change, but he can create momentum, and he can create arguments in the Iranian system that previously were not being made at the same level, and I think that's important. It gives us greater hope. There has to be follow-through, but that's the case of every politician, so we need to be able to see if Iranian politicians across the board, not just Rouhani, can follow through.
Femi, it's interesting you asked, is it down to one person? Hajar on Twitter has an answer. She says, it takes more than a president to change a society, and Iran's political system is complex. It doesn't always leave room for the president's decision. But actually, Femi, I want to shift gears now here, because we're a social media show, of course, and so one of the things that our community is telling us is something that's their finger is on the pulse of, and that is a video that was circulated not too long ago, a happy video. It was based on Pharrell's Happy song. On Facebook, Mike here says, I give Rouhani a 7. He's reaching out to the West, but he's still running a country where they give lashes to kids for singing a song on YouTube.
Yeah,
I'm going to, you know what I'm referencing.
Exactly. Let me just play a little bit of this video. So this video, you may have seen it. It's got a title which is the Happy Video Dances of Tehran. And when this video circulated, it went viral, but the young people involved in the video ended up with a suspended 6-month sentence and also 91 lashes. But it seems to me that they're actually representing a modern day contemporary version of what life in Iran is like, and then they were punished for doing that. Sharmeen, what's your analysis on how that was handled?
I'm a skeptic about these kind of things. I've covered Syria for 3 years now. I've seen a lot of perception swaying activities take place that later turned out not to be the case. Look, I think we can't be naive. Iran is the most secure country right now in its entire neighborhood, including Turkey. And there's good reason for that. So it's the chicken and the egg argument. You know, do you allow democratic or progresses, or first, or do you establish national security first? In this case, this country under siege has a lot of reason to wrap its arms around internet and social media. And there's Riza, nodding his head no, but in 2011, DARPA, the technology arm of the U.S. Department of Defense, spent tens of millions of dollars to enable the U.S. military to detect, classify, measure, and track social media and to sway perceptions. They've rolled out software that allows servicemen to automatically assume multiple personas. Cyberspace is now designated as an operational domain for the U.S. military.
What I find really interesting is that a lot of the conversation about Iran is couched around America, and to me it seems it's more important about what's happening in Iran than what's happening in America. But Reza, you were shaking your head as Sharmeen was talking.
Yeah, because the two aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, these poor kids made a video, put it on YouTube, and they got put in jail. Okay, that's what happened. And at the end of the day, now their lives are much more difficult than they were before. And why should you be put in jail and charged with a crime for making a YouTube video and when you're dancing around? I think it's just silly. It's not to say that there hasn't been a conflict between the U.S. and Iranian governments where they're trying to influence one another in multiple ways. It's to say that these kids did something that kids do and they got put in jail, and I disagree with the decision that was made by the Iranian government, as do a lot of other people, and I don't think it's symptomatic of U.S.-Iran relations or U.S.-Iran conflict. I think it's symptomatic of a problem that the Iranian government has had for quite some time. Hopefully Rouhani will follow through on his promises and try to help fix it over the long run.
Gisu, what did you want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that a lot of this conversation, we've been talking about maybe what the international community, how they grade Rouhani, but I want to go back to what Iranians think of Rouhani. And Rouhani made promises that voters elected him on, such as, let us not interfere in people's private lives every day. Also, viewing the arts as a security concern is the biggest mistake. So this happy video is symptomatic of something much larger. The reformist voters in Iran voted him in overwhelmingly to uphold those promises. So it's not only about, Iran's relations with Saudi or Iran's relations with the US, it's about domestic concerns at home. So I'd like to touch on that a little bit. Rouhani has not exhausted the limit of his presidential powers. So although some commenters were saying, all the power resides with the supreme leader, Rouhani has a lot of other powers that he has not yet exercised. And I want to see him do that over the next 3 years and really live up to the promises that he made to have a freer press, to increase gender equality. All of these great promises that he made and that the Iranian electorate really wants to see him achieve.
All right, Gissu, that's a great way to end. So Sharmeen, in the next 3 years, as the president rolls out the rest of his term, what would you like to see? Just briefly.
I'd like him to follow through with his promises in all spheres.
Right.
And I think it's going to be harder though than it has been the first year.
And Reza.
I would like to see the political, economic, and social aspirations of Iranians inside of Iran be met by their government, not just Rouhani, but including Rouhani.
All right, thank you Reza, Gissu, Sharmeen and also Mohammed as well for being part of this conversation. Last word goes to the community.
We're looking forward to the next 3 years. Elbor says Rouhani's handling of domestic and human rights issues is questionable. With all your eggs in the FP basket, foreign policy he means, he might lose youth support. So we shall see.
All right, so that wraps up this conversation. What will we be doing on Monday? Well, on Monday I will be in Paris. Qu'est-ce que tu fais, mademoiselle? On lundi.
I hope that you tweet us in French.
Bien sûr.
I will tell you what we're covering on Monday. We'll be asking questions.
Reza is like, what is this? Qu'est-ce que tu fais maintenant?
I want to go to Paris too.
They'll talk. I'll tell you about our show. Some say there's a gender bias in the way that female patients are diagnosed and treated, and we'll discuss why on Monday. Until then, we'll see you online.
Au revoir.